Any idea?
Sir, protecting the system from malware and viruses.
Okay. So what is system security?
Maybe like unauthorized चीजें ना हो पाए.
Okay, so that is security. So malware and all unauthorized,
Um,
maybe.
yes, sir. Technically, तो unauthorized हुआ means.
Hmm. Right. So the protection is from within the system, right? From one another activities. So we can use various mechanisms to ensure that only processes that have gained proper authorization from the operating system can operate on the files, the memory segment, the CPU, and other resources. Right? So the protection, it refers to a mechanism for what? For controlling the access of program, process, or users to the resources which defined by the computer system. Okay, so it's not from other, it's within and from one another, right? The one process having some resources or want to use some resources, right? The other process should not change or affect another process. So that is a protection, right? You have used the file, right? What you are setting? You are setting read permission, write permission, execute permission for different users. So you are protecting your file. You are protecting file means to some users you don't want to give execute right. So you set that. Suppose for group you don't want to set execute right. So you do that. And for some user you want to give that, suppose it's a owner, you want to give all the permission, read, write, execute. And for others only read permission. So you are protecting your file, right? So this is a protection. And the difference I told you, the in security and protection. Okay, so goals of the protection. So in one protection model, computer consists of a collection of objects, hardware or software, like your CPU as example for hardware, as software your file, right? So that is a software. Each object has a unique name and that can be accessed through a well-defined set of operation, right? So on each object, suppose it's a printer, so the operation that you can perform is print something. Okay, now the protection problem is to ensure that each object is accessed currently and only by those processes that are allowed to do so, not all the processes. Okay, so we need to provide a protection for several reasons, and the most obvious is need to prevent the misuse or intentionally violation of an access restriction by what? By a user. And of more general, we can say each program component active in a system use some system resources only in a ways is consist with some standard policy, right? क्या इसको एक्सेस देना है तो वही यूज करे, not all other process or randomly जिसको चाहिए वो सब ले जाए, right? It should not be like that. And the protection oriented system, it will provide a means of distinguish between authorized and unauthorized uses. means, and this is within the system, right? So is this the authorized use? Means some user is executing that file. Is it the uh, authorized one? If yes, then it is okay. If it is not, if it is unauthorized, then that should not be permitted. Okay. So now this protection is not only concern of the operating system designer, it should also be concern for the application developer as well, because when they design the application, they might use some of the resources of the operating system, right? And when they use these resources, the proper protection of that resources are also need to be taken care, right? So वो होना चाहिए. So for that, suppose मैं ऐसे ही सबको एक्सेस दे रहा हूँ, ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम कर्नल का एक्सेस सभी को है. So what happen? Any program, any damn program will affect my system. I am taking care of that thing, like proper user is doing that. Suppose one application I have installed and that application using the kernel commands, and now that application driver whatever has in that application, that is harmful to my system and damaging my system. So now my system is not protected, right? So what operating system has? They have user mode and kernel mode, right? So every uh, program, application program that is running in user mode, and when it needs access to a kernel, it goes from user mode to kernel mode, and when it goes to that kernel mode, then and then it can access that hardware, right? Or hardware more privileged commands. Okay, so this thing should be considered. And when we go to the principle of protection, the guiding principle is principle of least privilege. So what it means? This principle works mostly on all the things. Suppose we ask something to parents, so they work on this principle of least privilege कि इसको जितना चाहिए उतना ही दो, जितना चाहिए उतना ही दो. So the program user and system should be given just enough privilege to perform that task. So suppose उसको ये फाइल रीड करनी है, so just give read access, don't give write access, because that is not required right now. That is not required, right? So what these are, it limits the damage if entity has a bug or get or have malfunction or abused, right, by some another application. So the example is, uh, in your society the watchman might have keys for some public areas, so clubhouse उसकी सब की है. If there is some malfunction, कुछ चोरी हुई, कैसा कुछ हुआ, तो वो पार्ट अफेक्ट होगा, वो पार्ट अफेक्ट होगा अगर वो की लॉस्ट हो गई तो, नॉट द हाउस एंड ऑल. अगर सभी की उसके पास दे दो, देन इट्स मोर वनरेबल, मीन्स वो की लेके कोई भी एक्सेस कर सकता है. ओके, एंड दिस कैन बी स्टैटिक और डायनेमिक. स्टैटिक मीन्स द we have what I can say fixed access, right? Means ये प्रोसेस है, उसको एग्जीक्यूट करने के लिए ये रिसोर्स चाहिए और इसकी ये परमिशन चाहिए. That is static and that cannot be changed. Okay, now in dynamic, the privilege that will be changed by the process. that will change by the process in terms of domain switching or privilege escalation. Means in one domain I am giving read permission, and in another domain I am giving a write permission. So process can change from one domain to another domain to get the execute or write permission. क्योंकि पहले डोमेन में क्या है, only read permission. In next domain, what is that? It's a write permission, right? So I need to move from one domain to another domain, and that is possible using this domain switching. Okay, and there is privilege escalation as well. So now we know that this user has this user has this permission. So what you can do, you can change the user, right? The thing we are doing in a Unix operating system. What we do, sometimes we are not getting some access. We change the user with the user, a super user, and that have access to other that have most of all the access to our system, and we can complete our task. Okay. Now there is another principle that is need to know, and this is similar to your this principle of least privilege only. Okay. Okay, now next, mm, just wait if I'm not missing something. Okay. Now in the domain of protection, right? So a computer system, there is a collection of what? Process and objects. And by object, we mean both hardware object and software object. So your CPU, then memory segment, printer, disk, they are come under hardware objects. And your software objects are your file, program, and semaphores. These are the software objects, and each object has unique name that differentiate it from all other objects in the system, and each can be accessed only through well-defined and meaningful operation. And these are the, what you can say, abstract data type, your object. Okay. Now the operation that are possible may depend on the object. For example, on CPU, if it is a CPU, right, we can only execute. CPU में हम क्या करें, कोई भी टास्क है वो execute करेंगे. Memory segment, if it is a memory segment, then we can read and write something. And where if you have like CD-ROM and DVD-ROM, in that what you can do, you can just read from that. Okay. And if you have a data files, suppose files, then you can create a file, you can open a file, you can read a file, you can write a file, you can close the file, and also you can delete the file, right? And this is normal data file. If you have program file, right, you can read, write, and you can execute. Program file you can execute, data file you have data, right? And this is a special kind of data file which can be executed, and also delete operation that is also possible in this. Okay. Now this grain aspect, rough grain and fine grain. So rough grain privilege management is easier and simple, but least privilege now done in large chunks, right? The example is, suppose there is some file and each file has some name, and with that it has some bit, right? It has some bit as Well, now when you are executing, you are executing as some user. Now, when your set UID bit is set on, then what it does, it set the owner of that file as the current user जिसको वो एक्सेस चाहिए, राइट right? वो बना देगी और उसको एग्जीक्यूट करना है तो वो एग्जीक्यूट कर पाएगी. नाउ दिस थिंग इज नॉट गुड. व्हाई? बिकॉज इफ योर सेट यूआईडी इज ऑन, वो ऑन है. अब अगर यूजर कोई है, उसको कुछ एग्जीक्यूट करना है और उसका यूजर आईडी जो सेट हुआ वो रूट हो गया, देन व्हाट हैपन? You are getting the root user permission, right? और root की permission मिल गई means you can do anything with that operating system. Okay. In fine grain, what happened? For each object they make the access control list. Means ये object है, ये object में हमें क्या क्या permission देनी है, right? So they make that. So वाई दे आर कॉम्प्लेक्स? बिकॉज पूरा लिस्ट बनाना पड़ेगा, और उसके हिसाब से परमिशन देनी पड़ेगी कि ये फाइल है, ये फाइल को कौन कौन सी परमिशन है, कौन कौन से यूजर एक्सेस कर पाएंगे, दैट ऑल. ओके. नाउ दिस आर बैक, दैट इज अ रोल बेस्ड एक्सेस कंट्रोल. सो एन ऑपरेटर हु नीड्स अ माउंट टैब्स, राइट, कि मुझे टैब जो है, और यू कैन कंसिडर यूएसबी ड्राइव, मुझे वो माउंट करनी है ऑन सिस्टम. सो व्हाट आई विल डू, आई विल माउंट दैट. एंड रोल बेस मीन्स ये माउंटिंग करने के लिए जो भी कमांड है उसका ही एक्सेस मिलेगा, राइट. इफ देयर इज समथिंग रिलेटेड टू नेटवर्क, तो रोल बेस एक्सेस कंट्रोल में क्या होगा कि नेटवर्क के रिलेटेड जो भी कंट्रोल होंगे, नेटवर्क के रिलेटेड वो ही मिलेंगे, right? So that's why they are more protective, your access control list and your role based access control. And your domain, that can be user, process or procedure. Any doubt in this? And make sure that once we discuss that, this is somewhat theoretical, so go and read from this book. I am directly using the PPT from that, the PPT of that book only. Operating System Concept, 9th edition, Silvers or Galvin. You can directly refer that book. Any doubt in this?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, when you call some process, suppose some program executing and call some process, right? So, as a need to know or least privilege access, the procedure, suppose from one program or one process P, we call procedure A. So P है process, उसमें से हमने क्या इन्वोक किया? A. This is a procedure, right? So the procedure, this procedure should be allowed to access only its own variable and the parameter that is passed by this process. Okay. So this procedure is not allowed to access all variable of this process. This is what? This is also protection, right? क्योंकि ये प्रोसीजर को पूरा एक्सेस नहीं देना है. ओके. जो चाहिए वही मिलेगा, पूरा नहीं मिलेगा. Any doubt in this? So we are right now looking into protection. ओके, क्या क्या प्रोटेक्शन मीन्स उसमें आता है दैट वी आर सेइंग, और कैसे कैसे वो हो सकता है दैट वी आर सेइंग. ओके, वी विल सी लेटर ऑन द एक्सेस मैट्रिक्स एज वेल कि वो हम इम्प्लीमेंट कैसे करें, कि कैसे वो प्रोटेक्शन इंश्योर कर पाए प्रॉपरली. Okay, now consider another example that the process P that invokes a compiler to compile a particular file, right? The compiler, it should not be able to access files, your arbitrary files, that is a pure code, right? But it should have access only to well-defined subset of files, which is your source file, your listing file, maybe a linking file. Those access should be allowed to compiler, but not the whole proper code, right? When you compile and all, they generate different types of files, and those file access is available with your compiler, right? And conversely, your uh, compiler have also a file, private files, right? For optimizing your code or for optimizing resources, which process P should not be allowed to access, right? So both way the protection should be there. Both way the protection should be there. So this is about the principle of protection. The domain structure. Okay, so the process, it operates within protection domain. This is your domain, and it specify the resource that the process may access, right? It will specify, and each domain define set of objects. This O1, O3, O2, they are objects, and the type of operation that may be invoked on each object. This one, on each object, and the ability to execute an operation on an object, this is called what? Access right. So object 3, the access right is read and write. This is my access right? And this domain is a collection of what? Access right for different objects. And this is a ordered pair of what? Object name and right set. So object name, and this is a right set. So if example, if domain D has the access right, consider file F and read and write. So what you will write for that? So file F, so file F. So this is what? Object name and the write set, which is read and suppose write also. So this, whenever set in particular domain, the process belong to that domain can read and write this file, right? Can read and write this file. Means suppose process P1 belongs to this object, belong to domain D1. Then that process can perform read and write on object 3, read and write on object 1, execute on object 2, right? Now the access right, which is a pair of object name and rights, that can be common as well. It is not that your domain should be disjoint कि पूरा अलग ही होना चाहिए. No, it is not like that. Okay, so see here, domain D2 and domain D3, they have common uh, access right, that is on object 4, and the right is print. Right is print. So the process that belongs to D1 or D3, they can perform a print on this object 4. Suppose it is a printer, then it can perform that, right? Okay. Now you see that the process P1 that we are talking has read and write permission for object 1 in domain D1, right? But now suppose I want to execute that object. Suppose it is a some program file and I want to execute that. So the process must be moved from D1 to D3, D1 to D3. So now what you can do? You can do this. What? You can now perform execute operation on this. But this violates what? This thing. The domain. This domain violates the principle of need to know. Because सपोज O3 के लिए आपको जस्ट रीड चाहिए. O3 के लिए let's say O1, we are talking about O1 object 1. So object 1 के लिए हमें read चाहिए. But when process enters in this, suppose P1 यहाँ पे enter हुई, तो उसको क्या मिला? उसको दोनों मिल गए, read और write. Write तो मुझे चाहिए नहीं, right? So it violates this कि least privilege हम देना चाहते हैं. बट यहाँ पे क्या हुआ? रीड के साथ राइट भी मिल गया. रीड के साथ क्या मिला? राइट भी. Okay, so we want a dynamic change. So if it is a dynamic mechanism, so it's allow a domain switching and enabling process to switch from one domain to another, and also update or change the rights. Also update the change also update or change the rights of particular objects in domain or in another domain, right? So domain can you can visualize in different ways. So one is user may be domain, right? User may be domain. So in this case, the set of objects that can be accessed, it depends on the identity of the user, right? And domain switching occurs when user is changed. So now you are considering your domain as a user. Domain as a user. So ये यूजर को यही राइट्स है. अब मुझे कोई और राइट चाहिए. Then what you need to do for that particular file, you need to change the user like we are doing. कि नॉर्मल यूजर से हम क्या कर रहे हैं? सुपर यूजर, रूट यूजर में जा रहे हैं, राइट? सो दैट इज अ यूजर बेस. Then another is process. Another is process. So in this case, a set of objects that can be accessed depends on the identity of process. And domain switching occurs when one process sends message to another process and then waits for response. So अब इसमें क्या होगा? ये हो गए process, and based on that process for particular objects what I will set, right? And suppose I want some other access, I will send to some another process, complete the task and get it. Then each procedure may be a domain. So in this case, the set of objects then that can be accessed correspond to the local variables that define within the procedure. and domain switching occurs when procedure call is made. So now our domain, that is of now local variable of that particular process. Or domain switching means what? Calling that process. Okay. So this is about our domain structure. This is about domain structure, and that thing that I have explained about the domain that is accessed by user, right? Setting the set UID and all, that is in Unix operating system, right? And that found very vulnerable to different threats, because just the example that I given, right? कोई यूजर रूट यूजर बन गया तो पूरा एक्सेस सभी सब कुछ एक्सेस कर पाएगा. ओके, सो दैट शुड नॉट बी द केस. वो नहीं होना चाहिए. ओके, सो एक्सेस मैट्रिक्स, this thing will access matrix, right? This is more sophisticated thing that we'll see in next lecture. Any doubt in this?
No, sir.
Anyone else?
No, sir.
Okay. So